So my microphone wasn't on because I was whittering on to, no, it's okay, I was whittering on to Heather about her microphone. So we're starting a new series on how to be good today. And I've been threatening for some time to do a series on the subject of evil. But thinking about it, the idea of focusing on good seemed to me a lot more attractive. And it also seems an appropriate time, I think, to look at what it means to be good. Because I think as Krishnamurti famously said, deeply, humanity is craving a good society. Deeply, humanity is craving a good society. And I think that's true. We have our weekly Zen meditations on Tuesdays here at 8:30 in the morning. And as part of that, I read a short passage from a book called Zen Flesh and Zen Bones. And the passage that, I do it in order so that, I don't sort of cheat. And so whatever comes up, comes up. And the passage that I read this Tuesday seems so apt to what I'm talking about. So I'm going to read it to you today. The master Bankai, his talks were attended not only by Zen students, this master, but by crowds of people of all ranks and sects. He never quoted the sutras or indulged in scholastic dissertations. Instead, his words were spoken directly from his heart to the hearts of the listeners. His large crowds angered a priest of the Nichiren sect because all his adherents had left to hear them talk about Zen. This self-centered Nichiren priest came to the temple determined to debate Bankai. "Hey, Zen teacher," he called out, "wait a minute. Whoever respects you will obey you and what you say. But a man like myself does not respect you. Can you make me obey you?" Bankai said, "Come up beside me and I'll show you." Proudly, the priest pushed his way through the crowd to the teacher. Bankai smiled. "Come to my left side." The priest obeyed. "Actually, no, you might be able to hear better if you come to my right side. Why don't you just step over here?" The priest proudly stepped over to the right. "You see," observed Bankai, "you're obeying me, and I think you're a very gentle person. Now sit down and listen." What struck me from this is no matter how strident and opinionated people are, or wherever we might think they're coming from, in the end, what we're all craving for is a good society. The argument's all about how we understand to get there. When I think about the idea of good, the first scripture that comes into my head, a passage from the Bible, about Jesus, and it says, "A certain ruler asked him, 'Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?' 'Why do you call me good?' Jesus answered. 'No one is good except God alone.'" Which rather suggests we shouldn't be talking about good because it's an impossible aim. But if you look at you've got this thing, I've got this thing on my computer, when you click on the word in the Bible, it tells you what the Greek word is in that particular translation. When you click on the word good, it's the word agathos, where you get the word agape from. That's the word that's used, agathos. And it says that agathos is, the Greek meaning is of good constitution or nature. So it's having a good constitution or nature. And in a way, Jesus is right. That universality of what we think of as being good is only fully present in the ordering principle that is at the heart of our universe. So what is truly good? What is truly a good constitution or nature? The true good is what's at the ordering principle of the universe, one that is fully loving, which is giving with no expectation of return. That's what we think of as God. That's why he says it. But goodness is what we strive for, even if we can't call ourselves fully good. And goodness is what we want from society. And good itself it is an interesting word. It originally comes from a Proto-Indo-European root, which means, would you believe it, to unite, to be associated with, to suit. In other words, the original word for good means to gather together. So that was the first meaning of it. The sense of being kind and benevolent in terms of good comes from the 14th century, and with reference to the persons of God. That's really a 14th century idea. And the actually friendly and graciousness of good, fortunate, prosperous, and favourable, was late Old English. And in the Middle English, it became to mean well-behaved. There's a great line in Once in Royal David City, which is, Christian children all must be mild, obedient, good as he. And whenever I sang that next to my mother, she always dug me in the ribs like this. Of course, nowadays, whenever my children are around and they sing that hymn, no matter what age, I always dig them in the ribs. But that's the idea of good. The meaning of good really started off as being about the ability to unite, and then became about kindness and good behavior, and then became about holiness. So if goodness is really the ability to unite, it links with the concept of uniting with the divine. That's where it's going towards. It's uniting with the divine. Or yoga. Because the word yoga, of course, comes from the Sanskrit word yuj, which means to join. Yoga means to unite or to yoke. That's where the word yoga comes from. So I should have really called this course the Yoga of Goodness, but I didn't. Because, the root meaning of the word good and yoga are the same. About uniting with overall goodness that Jesus says that only God has the property of. All of which gives us the idea of the sort of area that we're dealing in here when we're talking about goodness. It involves concepts of behavior, of kindness, of manners, as in, we always say he's got good manners, that sort of thing, holiness, and uniting with the divine. All of which is brought to bear when we consider the idea of a good society, one that is united in kindness. Kindness, which comes from the word kin, which means family. So it's united in kindness. And I can't think of a more pressing area to be looking at the moment in the immediate future than the idea of kindness in society. Coming from a point of goodness, which I think is much better than coming from a point of opposition. To be in opposition is to try and solve the problem from the same level of consciousness that created the problem in the first place. And we're looking here to follow Einstein's motif of no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created the problem in the first place. So I think here we're not about placards and pitchforks and flaming torches. What we're about here is about reaching for a new level of consciousness. That's what we're about in this conversation around goodness. And for me, that new level of consciousness does speak about goodness. Now, I said I didn't want to talk about evil, and that was mainly from a realization that we had from our last course, which was Gathering in the Light. We did a whole series on gathering in the light. And the reason I just thought it was not a good idea to talk about evil, because one thing that we learned in the last course is that there is no such thing as darkness. There is only light that you cannot see. All that stuff about, different, light that we see has come from a certain level of spectrum. But there is also light in other levels of spectrums that we don't see. We call that darkness, but actually it is light that we cannot see. And I think the same is true for evil. And I think it's worth just having a think about that as we go into the idea of good, to think about evil. The same is true of evil. There is really no such thing as evil. There is only good that has not yet been realized. Just as light is everywhere, but we cannot see it. So, and we know this to be true, the divine is everywhere, or God is everywhere. It's just that we cannot always become aware of it. Originally, evil did not have the sort of demonic aspect that we now associate with it. It wasn't rooted in that demonic aspect. Evil was the word that Anglo-Saxons used for bad behavior. That's what, when they talked about evil, they really meant bad behavior. It meant bad, cruel, unskillful, defective, harm, crime, misfortune, disease. It was really about not being united with the divine in the good sense of the word. But in a sense, in a way of us explaining to ourselves why bad things happen, we've given evil an equivalent, not just of good behavior, but we have an equivalent to the divine order. We say that there is a divine order and there is an evil order. You get that in society, that idea, and it's quite prevalent. And of course, it's nonsense. It makes no sense because it sets up a fundamental dualism that we know not to be the reality of existence. That dualistic existence is not the reality. We know that in reality, there is one consciousness, one unitive beingness of which we are all a part. And that one beingness that created the universe, that gave us our lives, that one beingness has the character of love, of ultimate goodness. And that our goodness is determined by the extent to which we live our lives united with that ultimate goodness. And to that end, evil is just about really being on our own, not united with that goodness that guides us. And it's therefore not an ultimate reality, but like darkness is relative. Darkness is just the light that we cannot see, just as evil is the goodness that has not yet been realized. Which is why it's much more interesting to talk about good and to think about good than it is to think about evil, because good is of ultimate and eternal value, whereas evil is just of temporary existence. Evil is really a myth. A myth is a traditional story to explain the social phenomenon, and in this case, of bad behavior. We use the myth of evil to explain bad behavior. Why do they do this? Because they're evil. And that explains it. But it doesn't. Because the world is a function of good rather than anything else. And what we see as evil is really the misappropriation of good. Evil is really the misappropriation of good. Theft is the misappropriation of good, literally. What is stolen is a good that has been misappropriated. And all evil is of the same character. Evil is the misappropriation of good, and therefore is a function of good, and has to be defined not as an ultimate quality, but in terms of the good that has been misappropriated. Which is why good is much more interesting than evil. But what about the devil? I mean, you have to go into these things. I mean, what about the devil? Where does that come about? Once again, the devil is a myth. A traditional story to explain the social phenomenon, again, of bad behavior. In reality, what happens is we create an entity of evil. What we do is we take random points in the chaos of the cosmos, and those random points could be behavioral things, they could be anything. But we take these random points, and our perception, Heather was talking about seeing, what we do is we take these random points and we create a reality around these random points. We join up the dots and make up an entity, and then we call that the devil. The reason for such, why such things wreak such havoc in society, the reason why people go totally bonkers when they get into this area is that by their very nature they are unreal. And therefore, these random points in the cosmos are just that. They're random, that our imagination has given identity to. And then we wonder why they produce chaos, when in fact it is the imagination that's created them and then slavishly tries to obey something that doesn't exist that creates chaos. We create patterns where there are no patterns, rather than become united with the good and loving order that is at the center of our reality. There is only good. Everything else is a figment of our imagination that we then proceed to worship. We give worth to these things. Give worth to is the meaning of worship. That's where the actual word comes from. It means to give worth to. And the more we give worth to these non-beings, the more we're taken away from being united with the good that's at the center of all. Now, I'm not saying that bad things don't happen. They do. It is bad for the gazelle that is brought down by the lion. But it's not evil. It is bad that we suffer from weather events, but it's not evil. It's bad that we're robbed and beaten or persecuted. But it's not evil in the ultimate sense. It is more characterized by the lack of good. A lack of being united with the fundamental loving good that is at the center of the universe. And all of that is a function. All that bad behavior is a function of a lack of understanding of how the world works. The reason those things happen is there is a lack of understanding of what gets results, what works. People who oppress just do not understand how the world works. They do not understand what it means to be good because they have no concept of being united with the divine order that is at the center of all things. It's like using a machine gun to open a door rather than just turning the handle. It just doesn't work, It just destroys things. It's like the church persecuting Galileo because it said that the earth moved around the sun. They just did not understand. And the English particularly are difficult. It's like when you're in a foreign country and people don't understand, and you shout at them to try and get you to understand. It just doesn't work. Don't you understand what I'm saying? No. That's the same sort of thing. The way that you move to the next level of consciousness is to realize that people are not intrinsically bad or wrong. They just don't understand how things work. And our role is to respond in such a way as to help them understand. That's what Gandhi did. That's what Dr. King did. That's what Jesus did. And that is our way too. We have to find a way to be good. And that goodness will create the understanding that is needed. Now you might think that this is totally unrealistic and that just being good has never done anyone good in the past. But that's to underestimate the goodness that has brought us to this level of civilization, with schools and hospitals, with institutions that support the vulnerable, with the abolition of slavery, with the development of civil rights, gender equality, and human rights. All these came about by people expressing the good in themselves at whatever cost to themselves, so as to make a contribution to create the understanding that what they were fighting for was necessary. Dr. King, who we celebrated this week, used his life to create the understanding that all men are equal, really and truly, not dependent on their skin color or their gender. And when these rights were signed into law until the 1960s, it was done because people understood what he was trying to get across to them. It was finally understood when LBJ signed it into law. We have to get people to understand these concepts of a common good, that we as humanity are family, as we are family with all sentient beings. And you know, it's not an impossible task. It has been the aim of all good people in the past. And we have to find out how to be good so as to have that understood in the present. Thank you. So, listen, what we tend to do in here is, Heather and I will witter on from the front, but we like to give people an opportunity to come back at us, to disagree with what we've said, to share an experience, to add something in, to make a contribution, to take us in a different direction, as this is an organic, growing conversation. Sometimes we just have silence, which is good enough in itself, but would anybody like to say anything at all, make a contribution at all? Yes, Brennan, thank you.
As always, thank you so much for your thoughts, and it stimulated and stirred a lot in me. I've been thinking, actually been reading a lot. If you're familiar, Daniel Christian Wall, Regenerative Culture, or the concept of regenerative practices just at all. And this idea of good being something that unites, and been making me think a lot about community, because humans can't really thrive without community, right? And I think we see the results of that. Our world we've become so atomized, so fragmented. That sort of concept of the rugged individual is kind of spun out. I think it's played itself out. We've seen now that that's not really a viable way for being in the world anymore. But this idea of regeneration, it's been on my mind a lot, and what that means is, or what I'm coming to understand it to mean, is that it creates the conditions for life to thrive. So can you do that by yourself as a rugged individual? No, you can't. Anytime that you come into community with somebody or something, and you create the conditions for that thing to thrive, then that, to me, kind of correlates with your concept of good. If you're familiar with Carol Sanford at all, she sort of was really big in the regenerative practices in the business community, but what she talks about is that idea of emergence, is that when two things come together, they're separate. You could look at each of their individual components, and when they come together, you can never predict the thing that comes out of that. It's that emergence. And that's actually recently been backed up by neuroscience in education. Mary Helen Immordino Yang talks about this, when real true learning happens when people come together in community, and this new emergent property sort of comes out of it. And so I guess, to me, that really feels like all that is good, and being good in the world, and trying to do that as much as possible. And when we kind of undermine the strength of community, we undermine someone's own vitality and health within that community. That kind of becomes maladapted. Which brings me to the last thing it made me think of, was in this neuroscience research, they talked about adaptive epigenesis, if you're familiar with that term at all.
Adaptive?
Epigenesis.
No.
So in human, it's really amazing. It's beautiful. It's one of those things that when you look at the biology, humans, and how we've evolved, that just there's such a beauty there. But it's that we shed a bunch of chromosomes and DNA and stuff, and we embedded how to become a human into culture. So we have about the same amount of chromosomes, I think, or something like as a bee, or like, for as complex as we are, we should seemingly have much more complex DNA structures, but we don't. It's because we shed and we put these things on community so that we could adapt to whatever the changing circumstances were. So the adaptive epigenesis actually determines that you can't actually be fully human without being in community, as we've seen, like the feral children that they've found in parts of the world, that once you get past a certain level of even language, with the brain, you can't bring language on, right? So we've shed these things out of the system. So like a snake can come right out of the egg and just be a snake, but you can't come right out of the womb and be a human without that community. So I guess that's, just my way of saying thank you for putting that out there and is helping me make all these different connections there. Actually, the last thing I would say, last person that made me think of, is the Simon Sinek's idea of the just cause. And that is the thing that you aspire to that you can never achieve. And I think sometimes I get really frustrated with not being where I think I need to be. But it's the idea that we'll never get there. And I think you hear this in spiritual teachings all the time, even the great masters. It's not that you ever get to a destination, but it's about constantly trying to evolve your consciousness.
Yeah. Well, Brendan, thank you for that incredibly thoughtful series of shares. I thought that was really interesting, all of it. But it did remind me, I did see when various people were talking about how we respond to circumstances in the world at the moment. And I heard someone, I can't remember who was saying, look, the thing to do, join a community. Become part of a community. Don't be on your own with this, but be together. And that's why it's fantastic that, we're here together right now. It's coming together and uniting in that way and sharing in that way. And I think the idea of coming together and recognizing that idea of being community. I love this idea that when you come together as community, something else comes out of it. I think that's a wonderful idea. And I've been reading a book at the moment, again, just to pick up on something else you were saying. And in talking about Zen, one of the big things that you have to have in Zen meditation is you have to have faith that you are going to be enlightened, but you also have to have doubt. Not doubt that you're not going to be enlightened, but the doubt that is there, which simply says, I don't know what is going to happen, is the doubt of not knowing what is happening, and holding the not knowing what the result is going to be, and still carrying on with the intention, even having that there. And that forms a greater sense of the ability to become united in the way that one does in Zen meditation. So thank you for that. That's great. Somebody else. Yes, Bob.
I just want to share a short quote from Abraham Lincoln. When I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. And that is my religion.
Say that again.
When I do good, I feel good.
Right.
When I do bad, I feel bad. And that is my religion.
Right. Thank you. That's lovely.
On my refrigerator.
That's great. Fantastic. Thank you. Anybody else? Yes, we'll have CP and then Ward.
So in my life, the Bible was always sort of the barometer for good and evil. And, there's all kinds of things in the Bible about evil. Satan being thrown out of heaven by Michael and all that. And I just wonder, what was before that, and if that is part of the myth, before Christianity and before these things were written, what was the feeling? I mean, I know that from the Old Testament, we're God's chosen people. Is that the people are bad? They're not our fault. What was before that? How did people relate to the light they couldn't see, or the goodness that hadn't yet been observed or experienced.
Yeah. I mean, the Bible was written, I think the Old Testament was written, someone's going to tell me I'm wrong, but I think it's 5,000 BC about, I think. Does it sound right? Anyway, it was written a long time ago. I mean, thinking of your question, I suspect that before that, the general experience in the world was, ah! Ah! And actually, the great thing about that is that, the understanding came in of the concept of goodness. I think that arises. You have to, can you imagine the people surviving all that quest for fire stuff and all that business, and arriving at an understanding suddenly that in spite of the of life, that there was a fundamental goodness. And I think that is a more important step to take in our evolution than the random ideas about apples and devil and all that sort of stuff, which is like saying, okay, this is why you feel that bad stuff, But really, I think it's a huge step forward. The concept of goodness is so important, I think. Yeah, Ward.
You talk about being part of community. I think at the Aspen Chapel, we have 10 or 12 years ago, the Aspen Heretical Society. And you mentioned Galileo, and Copernicus was a heretic. And a heretic is somebody that questions, doesn't follow orthodoxy. Galileo certainly was labeled as a heretic. So we in this community, the Aspen Heretical Society, question. Now there's a new ruler in town. There's a new president, a new orthodoxy, and we can be heretics by not following those edicts. But I think what we're trying to do is find harmony, good. If misbehaving is evil, then what's the lyric in a song? Ain't misbehaving?
Yes.
But this last song, harmony was when the bass joined the piano. There was a harmony there, a resonance there. And if we can as a heretics find the harmony that you guys found, it would be awesome.
Thank you. That's lovely. Lovely. Anything finally?